So I feel as though sports journalism and sports media in general has been going downhill for a while now. You have things like ESPN that just aren't as good as they used to be, and they're filled with just absurd takes and talk shows rather than actual sports news and sports highlights. Now, someone who explains this well is Kofi, who goes in depth about the NBA's journalism and media problem from the last few years, and since he's been in and around sports journalism and media for a while, he is actually someone to trust. But this isn't just an NBA problem, it's a sports problem, and that obviously includes football. And nothing highlights this problem more than this clip right here.
To be totally honest with you, I don't understand why anyone over the age of about 12 is wearing a football kit at any point in their life anyway.
You've never worn it to a game or casually?
I've never worn it in public. I've never worn it out. I've never worn it on the tube. I've never worn it to work. I've never worn it anywhere social.
So there's a lot to unpack here, but let's just start off with the obvious. What the f*** are you talking about? Like, I don't get the point that you're trying to make. Now, you're saying that not only wearing a kit with a player's name on the back is bad, but even wearing a kit of the club you support in general with no name whatsoever is a sign that they aren't a true fan? So what does that make you, Rory? I mean, you said that you don't like it, but you're wearing a kit here, so you're not a fan of Chelsea, right? You've traveled home and away for them, you've watched hundreds of matches. No, sorry, man. You're playing dress up. Clearly, you're an Arsenal fan. Come on, you Gunners. Am I right, buddy? No, I'm just playing. We're happy to have you. But this clip perfectly shows the problem with modern football journalism and media that's been happening for a while now. And that's that it's all about engagement and getting content rather than actual sports news and sports stories. And this isn't some random content creator's channel or someone with a blue check mark on Twitter. This is talksport, a professional talk show that routinely has professional pundits discussing football and other sports topics. Now, I'm not sure when exactly talksport took this turn, but it's following a trend that other forms of football journalism and media are taking as well, where instead of writing about interesting stories or discussing in-depth analysis of clubs and players, they do whatever it takes for clicks and engagement. Now, talksport is a prime example of this switch for professional companies nowadays because they'd rather talk nonsense about the Premier League being the best league in the world and the most exciting one to watch when exciting matches happen quite literally in every other single league in the world, or how Pogba winning the World Cup was the worst thing to happen to him, or how Saka needs to be cautious about not following the path of Raheem Sterling. Yeah, you know, Raheem Sterling, the guy who's won 4 league titles, 5 League Cups, and FA Cup Footballer of the Year in 2019, and has participated in multiple World Cups and Euro tournaments. Yes, Bukayo Saka should not follow in those footsteps. I agree. He should win 10 league titles instead. Now, I'll admit, while talksport is a professional brand, you could argue that it's very different from beat journalists and beat writers, people who follow specific clubs and players so they can get a more in-depth analysis and actually know what they're talking about. Now, these journalists, while not always giving great opinions, can at the very least be trusted more often than someone trying to cover multiple clubs and leagues. These beat writers can be seen everywhere, from content creators to those writing for newspapers. But just because someone has a big following or is writing for a big newspaper doesn't mean they're always great, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're beat writers for specific teams. Like Ian Herbert, for example, journalist for the Daily Mail and who condescending elitists have on their bedroom wall for motivation. Sorry, Timmy, you're not ever gonna reach his level. He's the GOAT. Now, as I mentioned, he's not someone who follows a specific club or a specific player, as evidenced by his last 2 articles. One talking about Sheffield Wednesday's unsafe stance, and the other talking about Chloe Kelly. Now, does covering multiple topics mean that you're always going to be making a mistake? No, obviously not. Does it mean that you're always going to be impartial and unbiased? also know. There is going to be a time where someone who tries to cover a wide array of topics makes a mistake here and there, but majority of the time, they still do very, very good work. That's still possible. But for Ian here, old Herbster? No, that's not how he rolls, okay? For his Sheffield article, the tweet itself is off to a bad start because he uses the incorrect stand in his picture. You could find the correct one on Google, or, just look at the replies. They will tell you. The other thing is that he misspells disgrace. Now, you could tell me that it's a bit nitpicky, but I would argue for a journalist, getting things right is a requirement for the job. But even if we ignored those parts, the article itself was nothing more than a hit piece towards the club in general, rather than the disastrous owner that fans themselves dislike. An agenda is something that probably most journalists would try to avoid, but I guess that's part of old Herbie's charm, because he lets that agenda show when he talks about Chloe Kelly, or should I say Marcus Rashford, actually. Again, straight off the bat, he praises Kelly for being a modest footballer who reels in her ego, saying Manchester City marginalized her and that fueled her to help England win the Euros. While yes, City did marginalize her by not playing her during an injury crisis, she isn't exactly the most modest player. She hit the Calma celebration after scoring a tap-in from her missed penalty and had this to say after winning the Euros.
Pressure? What pressure?
Now look, don't get me wrong, I genuinely love the attitude that Kelly is showing here. It expresses confidence while not being over the top, and you're able to say a lot if you can back it up, which she did. But this is obviously not a modest attitude, so Herbert was just wrong here. But what really stuck out was the fact that he had to call out Rashford and Garnacho in the process. Now, if you want to be wrong and say a player with a little ego has no ego, that's one thing. But to tear down other players, namely one who seems to be routinely targeted by the English press, that is completely unnecessary. And I'm starting to understand why the English hate journalists. Like, it is definitely making sense now. Now, these professional journalists are starting to get a little out of hand because it's actually starting to spread to television, with these stations regularly hiring personalities and former players rather than analysts who have a true love for the game. Now, I could really highlight a couple people that kind of come to mind immediately. You got Jamie Carragher, Gary Neville, who, while not as bad as the previous people that I've mentioned thus far, can still let their biases show and be a little bit of a controversy while on the air. But there's also someone else that I want to mention. Tim Howard. Now look, I love the guy, all right? His World Cup performance in 2014 against Belgium is burned into my mind forever, as is his glorious beard in the nickname Secretary of Defense, which is just objectively cool. But Timmy, I'm sorry, man. You are so boring. Like, do you guys want to hear his thoughts on the game's first half highlights?
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't show you actually, because then you'd all click off my video. Now, like I said, these guys are usually not as bad as those on talksport or some of these so-called journalists, but we could argue we should be holding them to a higher standard. So when we get analysts and commentators showing their bias, giving outlandish opinions, and just doing a below average job, we shouldn't settle for it just because we're all used to seeing worse opinions like this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the coverage in the general media of football rather than the journalism itself, because the Premier League does a very lackluster job of actually showing matches. Now, just like with everything else nowadays, you'll need like 38 different subscriptions just to watch your favorite club's matches, let alone everyone else in the league. But even if you do have the money to splurge on all of those subscriptions like Peacock, NBC, Fubo, Sling, Sting, Fling, Bada Bing, that doesn't guarantee that you're actually going to be able to watch every single match. Here's a list of which clubs were broadcasted on national television in the UK. And first, I want to say that I get it, okay? Yes, obviously the big clubs, the top 6, are going to be televised more often than others. I understand why that's happening. However, it just would be nice if there wasn't such a large gap between them. Manchester United, obviously a big club, but they were genuinely dreadful last season, yet they had at least double the amount of matches televised compared to 4 other clubs. Spurs were even worse in the Premier League and had 2 more matches televised than Nottingham Forest, a club that made a genuinely surprising and heroic run for top 4. I think for fans at any level, this is a bit of a letdown because for someone who's just getting into the sport and trying to find which clubs and players they like, they're going to have a limited selection to choose from. Other fans may be interested in specific storylines, like, as we mentioned before, Nottingham Forest suddenly making a top 4 charge, and they'd want to watch those matches in order to understand how they've done that, while some might want to know why Chelsea, a top 4 club, bought a striker from Ipswich who was relegated. Lack of availability means people can't watch more matches, which means that they're going to get their opinions from random clips and random videos taken out of context, which then means that their opinions like this are going to become more frequent. Now, it's maybe not as bad as this opinion, but this is the result of modern football media. I mean, where do you think I found this clip in the first place? I once again dove headfirst into hell for about 30 seconds before seeing that Rory Jennings clip. Now, I never would have had to see that if I'd stayed on the following tab, which, you know, I'll admit, definitely my bad. It's a mistake that I clearly refuse to learn, but at least it reminded me that I'm thankful for the people that I do follow who I can trust to give me reasonable opinions about a club or a league that I don't follow too closely, because even though I've been trashing modern football journalism for a while, there's still plenty of creators and beat writers that you can follow. For example, someone like Brazilian Fury is, fun fact, Brazilian, and anytime I have a question about a Brazilian player, a Brazilian club, or the Brazilian league, I can trust him to give me a fairly unbiased and reasonable opinion about those topics. And I did something similar when I made a video over the Irish League. I went to someone who specifically covers the Irish League specifically. When I made my video over Stuttgart, I didn't just get all of my opinions from random clips or just look at a couple of stats. I did more than that. I went directly to a Stuttgart fan to discuss why they suddenly did so well that season and who their top performers were. Even with clubs who I think that I have a somewhat decent idea about, I will still go to them and ask what their opinion is, because they will certainly have a better idea than me. Most of the time. You can also do something called reading, you damn Neanderthals, specifically reading articles from journalists who actively cover one club, those beat writers of the Premier League that we've talked so much about. Because let's be honest, it's near impossible to have an extremely reasonable and in-depth opinion about multiple leagues and multiple clubs. There is just too much of this sport in the world to cover all of it. So that's where I come in. Arsenal are going to be winning AFCON and Copa America. Okay, now this guy thinks just because they're international tournaments that Arsenal can't win. Clearly he's a casual and a real disgrace to the game.